So this leads us to conflict theory. Again, I'll remind you that conflict theory focuses on inequality that results in struggle, economic inequality. And with that in mind, I'm hoping at this point you've read enough about conflict theory and I've talked about it enough that you're having an easier time automatically connecting the theory to various topics. So crime and deviance in regard to conflict theory, to me, is a very easy fit in many ways. You've got people who, for whatever reason, do not fit the ideal mold of a citizen, and thus they are perceived to be deviant, to be different from the expected norm, struggling, trying to be a good citizen. Or, even at the most simple level, with conflict theory, you have people with a lot of wealth and people without a lot of wealth. So there's a struggle between them, between the socioeconomic status of each of them. So on one hand, conflict theory as applied to crime and deviance seems like an easy fit, but there's much more to it than that. Steven Spitzer takes a conflict view of deviance and crime based on private property ownership, which will probably sound a bit odd when you first hear it, so you need to follow his train of thought. According to Spitzer, private property ownership is the basis of a capitalist society. That seems easy enough to understand. With this private property ownership necessarily comes a dependence on labor, on the working class to keep it going. That still makes sense. And in addition to depending on the labor of the working class, private property ownership in a capitalist society also depends on their respect for authority, on their respect for and willingness to do what they're told. So, when crime or deviance occurs, when a thief steals, what they are actually doing is challenging private property ownership. When somebody is not a productive member of society by being a dutiful worker, they are being deviant and in effect challenging capitalism. So when anybody goes on strike, they are deviant because they are not respecting the authority of their job and willingly doing what they're told. Essentially, anyone who, for whatever reason, does not actively contribute to and support capitalism, and thus private property ownership, is at least deviant and, depending on their behavior, perhaps a criminal. So you really do need to follow Spitzer's train of thought here to understand what he's saying. You don't have to agree with it, but follow his train of thought to understand him. Spitzer is not naive in his assertions. He absolutely recognizes that people in the upper class also commit crimes or are simply deviant without actually breaking the law. But the fact is, when somebody of an upper class breaks the law, they tend to have a very different experience than when somebody of a lower class does. So to begin with, as I've already said, white-collar crimes, which are much less likely to occur in public than street crimes, and thus are less likely to be reported than street crimes, are also more likely to be committed by the upper class. These are also less likely to be prosecuted when they are reported, and if prosecuted, the accused is less likely to be convicted. And you know, I've thought about this more than once when there's a high-profile case that garners a lot of media attention. Going back for several years, for example, I think of O.J. Simpson and what was referred to as his dream team of lawyers that he had to defend him against 2 murder charges in 1994. He had 8 to 9 of the absolute best top lawyers in the United States working full-time, focused on just his one case. He spent millions of dollars on his defense. Now, absolutely, race was a huge issue in this case. Police incompetence was a big issue in this case. But at the same time, there was so much evidence against him, including DNA evidence, and he was still found innocent. At this point, I feel comfortable stating it's generally widely accepted at this point, regardless of one's race, that O.J. Simpson was guilty. And, as indicated in the textbook, Conrad Black, a multimillionaire publishing magnate, was charged and convicted on 4 counts of fraud in 1997. You might be thinking, well, yeah, Jennifer, but he was convicted. But appeals resulted in almost all of the criminal charges being dropped, and instead of 6.5 years, he served just over 40 months. Something that would never have been possible without the ability to pay for a superior defense. So according to conflict theory then, not surprisingly, it is strongly argued that those people with more money and wealth have more control over the criminal justice system in several ways. Control theory, also known as social control theory or social bond theory, states that deviant or criminal behavior is the result of a lack of meaningful bonds with society. So instead of explaining why people are deviant or break the law, control theory takes the opposite approach by trying to explain why people obey rules, why people's behavior usually does conform to social norms. This idea states that there are a lot of rewards for deviance and crime, and all of us know that. So knowing this, why aren't we all deviant? Why aren't we all out there participating in criminal activity? As Travis Hershey explains, it is a person's relationships, their commitments and values, their norms and beliefs that encourage them not to break the law. And each of us takes in these moral codes. We internalize them so that we feel we have a stake in our community as a whole. A person will have strong ties to their wider community. And because of that, they'll voluntarily limit their propensity to commit deviant acts, whether it's being deviant or committing a crime. They conform, and the vast majority of us do conform. If a person is deviant or even goes so far as to break the law, it's because they have not internalized these values and norms and beliefs as everybody else has. They don't have the same strong relationships or commitments that everybody else does. So social controls have not been able to ensure their conformity. For them, they find these social controls to be too weak. This is why it's called control theory. Now, according to this theory, then, we would expect a person who is young, single, and unemployed to be more likely to be deviant because they would have weaker social bonds, while somebody who was married and working to be less likely to be deviant because their bonds would be stronger. So social control theory focuses on how the absence of close relationships with others can, in a sense, free people from the social constraints the rest of us feel, thereby allowing them to engage in deviancy or crime. And with this in mind, control theory tries to understand the ways in which it might be possible to reduce the likelihood of criminality developing in individuals by increasing their social ties. Now, Dr. Hershey applied this manner of thinking specifically to adolescents, comparing them to adults. And again, keeping this idea of strong or weak social ties in mind. So he stated that younger people are more likely to be deviant or to commit a crime because their social ties are simply not as strong as those of an adult. An adolescent hasn't been completely incorporated into society yet to the same degree that an adult has. And it isn't that an adult doesn't have the same impulses as an adolescent to be deviant. It's that an adult has more self-control because they've been completely socialized. So according to Hershey, adolescents who are likely to commit a deviant or criminal act are likely to lack 4 specific kinds of social control. They are likely to have weaker social bonds regarding 4 specific areas. So keep in mind what we're talking about here is socialization. We've already talked about socialization. And one of the things socialization does or does not do is create and maintain social bonds. So, adolescents tend to have fewer social attachments to parents, teachers, or other people they might be able to view as a role model. If that's the situation of their life, they're likely to have weaker social controls. So for adolescents, according to Hershey, a key aspect of social control is found within the family, through their interaction with their parents and their feelings towards them. So the greater the attachment to parents, the lower the likelihood of involvement in delinquent behavior. If they tend to have fewer opportunities for furthering their education, and as a result, for a good job. Adolescent attachment to school is seen by Hershey's social control theory as a fundamental means of establishing social control. Classrooms that provide strong emotional support and supportive social interaction. According to Hershey, without seeing real opportunities for themselves regarding their education, an adolescent is more likely to foster resentment. Hershey also notes that adolescents who have fewer involvements in conventional institutions, such as school, are more likely to be delinquent. And if they tend to have weaker beliefs in traditional values and morality. And all of that ties back into the first 2 points about social attachments to parents and other people and education. So to kind of summarize conflict theory and everything I've spoken about so far, we had Steven Spitzer talking about how when deviance and crime occurs, what they are doing is actually challenging private property ownership and capitalism. And he also touched on how the upper class have a much different experience with deviance and crime than the lower class. And then Travis Hershey developed social control theory, which states that deviant or criminal activity is the result of a lack of meaningful bonds with society. So, the last thing we're going to look at here in terms of sociological theory is feminism. Feminist contributions to crime and deviance. And the fact is that historically speaking, women have been at a disadvantage in society in several ways. To put it very simply, they have historically been much less powerful than men in all social institutions. So, to put this in a more academic way, there have always been gender-based power differences in society, causing differences in how laws are applied, interpreted, and in terms of prosecution. As indicated in the text, for example, the fact is that historically speaking, some crimes against women were simply non-existent. It isn't that certain crimes were ignored or not taken seriously enough. It's that they were not considered to be a crime at all, such as sexual assault towards a spouse. And I want to be even more specific here and point out that it wasn't just that these incidents were not recognized in the criminal code. It was that these were not recognized socially speaking as well by wider society as a whole. So both socially and legally, it was not considered a crime to force non-consensual sexual activity on one's spouse. And what this resulted in many ways is that women were truly powerless. They did not even have power or control over their body, over their own physical self. This didn't encourage their victimization, but certainly allowed it, and in allowing it, created a social norm, a standard in terms of what was or was not considered appropriate, a norm regarding how women were viewed overall. So the previously held widespread belief reflected in the criminal code that a man could not rape his wife because, well, she was his wife. The origins of this concept of a marital exemption from rape laws was the idea that by marriage, a woman gave irrevocable consent for her husband to have sex with her anytime he demanded it. And part of this included a legal doctrine under which, upon marriage, a woman's legal rights were subsumed by those of her husband. So marriage was traditionally understood as an institution where a husband had control over his wife's life. Control over her body was just part of that greater control that he had in all areas concerning her. This is why a woman was first considered the property of her father, who would then at a marriage ceremony walk her down the aisle and give her away in marriage to her husband when she would become the property of her husband. It wasn't just a symbolic giving away the bride as it is now. And this is why some brides no longer do this. and no longer take on the last name of their husband when they get married. So a man could not be prosecuted for raping his own wife because she was his possession. But as part of the feminist movement, activists challenged the presumed right of men to engage in forced or coerced sex with their wives. And as the concepts of human rights for all and equality for women grew, the marital rape exemption or defense became more widely viewed as inconsistent with these societal changes, rightfully so. Remember all of the change that occurred in the 60s into the 70s, spoken about previously. This supported and encouraged change, not focused specifically on sexual assault all the time, but in a wider sense. Change occurred regarding the position of women that caused the distribution of power in society to be redistributed. Not necessarily in a completely equal manner, but at least a redistribution. And part of this included working systematically since the 1960s to overturn the marital rape exemption and make it a crime, so that we now recognize the idea of marital rape, that it exists, it is a crime legally, and it's also socially condemned. But if you search this online, you're going to be really surprised at the dates this became effective. For the vast majority of countries, it wasn't until the 70s or 80s. So, for example, in Canada prior to 1983, rape was considered an offense only outside of marriage. 1983, people. So prior to 1983, a husband could not be charged with raping his wife. A wife could only charge her spouse with indecent assault, common assault, or assault causing bodily harm. But on January 4th, 1983, this was officially changed, making assault against one's spouse a criminal offense. Or a wife could charge her husband with aggravated sexual assault if the crime also included being beaten. So coming back to the earlier discussion of stigmatization, the word rape was also removed from the criminal code and replaced with sexual assault, so that the moral stigma often connected to the word rape would be removed from victims, and to highlight the violent nature of the act by including the word assault. It isn't like this everywhere in the world, as the previous, let me go back, as this map shows. In Ethiopia, rape law explicitly excludes a husband as a possible perpetrator. In South Sudan, the law states, sexual intercourse by a married couple is not rape within the meaning of this section. So let me go ahead again. So date rape and acquaintance rape are other kinds of sexual assault that were previously not taken as seriously as they should have been, and again, came with an enormous amount of stigma for the victim, resulting in the powerlessness of women. So date rape refers to sexual assault when there's been some sort of romantic or potentially sexual relationship between the two parties, while acquaintance rape also includes rapes in which the victim and perpetrator have been in a non-romantic, non-sexual relationship. So, for example, as co-workers or neighbors. And unfortunately, it used to be the norm that many societies ranked the seriousness of a rape based on the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. I have a difficult time even saying that because to me it's so distasteful. But the fact is that assault by somebody the victim does know at all, a stranger, by somebody the victim doesn't know at all, a stranger, was more likely to be perceived as a sexual assault by one that was perpetrated by a person the victim knew. And because of this perceived distinction, these kinds of sexual assaults were either considered to be less serious than that by a stranger, because it implies that the victim is partially to blame. So the basic concept of date rape is actually relatively new, relatively recent. It's only since the 1980s that the term and an understanding of it has spread. Not that it didn't occur before, it certainly did, but an awareness of it and a recognition of it was not there. Currently in the States, it's estimated that 1 in 5 teenage girls experiences some form of sexual assault. It's estimated that 1 in 3 Canadian women will experience sexual assault in their daily life. And you'll find various statistics for these. They're all similar, but not exactly the same. In fact, stats indicate that 39% of women report having experienced at least one incidence of sexual assault since the age of 16. These patterns have remained pretty much consistent, unfortunately. So, to kind of wrap up the feminist perspective, I just want to point out that the very last paragraph of this section in the textbook comments that as the position of women in society has shifted and changed and evolved overall, this has resulted in a slow, subtle increase in the likelihood of women to participate in criminal activities. The text even states this has allowed women to behave more like men, which is an odd way to phrase it in my opinion, but it's true. So earlier I said that approximately 3/4 of the crime in Canada is committed by men. That is slowly changing. And this could be all on its own an entire class that I would personally find really interesting, although we're not going to get into it here. So just to summarize everything with sociological theory, we have symbolic interactionism, which generally explains deviance in crime, stating that people learn to be deviant. They learn to behave in a criminal manner. And symbolic interactionism also focuses on labeling theory, stating that being labeled deviant leads a person to engage in deviant behavior. For functionalism, Emile Durkheim focused on how breaking a rule or a norm then reinforces to other people what that rule or norm is, thus helping to perpetuate society and creating solidarity. While Robert Merton focused on the American dream and how a widespread belief that anybody can achieve it, even though this is not true, creates strain and how people react to that strain. For conflict theory, Stephen Spitzer talked about how when deviance and crime occur, what they are doing is challenging private property ownership, and how the upper class have a much different experience with deviance and crime than the lower class. And Travis Hershey developed control theory, which states that deviant or criminal activity is the result of a lack of meaningful bonds with society. And then finally, for a feminist sociological perspective regarding deviance and crime, it simply focuses on how, historically speaking, women were treated much differently in society. Not just differently, but valued much less, creating a powerlessness. But that has at least partially changed.